Hey, I want to talk with you about how to draft the part of your introduction that presents the cultural tension you're going to explore and defines both terms for your reader. But before I do that, let me quickly explain why we don't include the thesis in this early activity. We're going to write our thesis, which will be the last part of our introduction, actually after we've drafted the entire paper. And the reason we put off the thesis till the end is we're going to wait to see what we discover in the process of writing this paper as we put together each body paragraph, and each passage in each body paragraph says something different about the tension. We're going to let that play out. We're not going to handcuff ourselves by committing to an argument before we fully thought through, analyzed, and interpreted the evidence. And so we're going to go through the body of our paper first and return to the thesis at the end. And based on what we actually write in those body paragraphs about the cultural tension, then we're going to construct an argument that provides an umbrella for those observations, those interpretations that we make. But we are going to write part of our introduction right now. The thesis is going to wait, but we are going to define our terms. In other words, when you write an essay about a cultural tension, you're setting forth a pair of terms that are going to frame your argument. It might be racial equality and racial hierarchy, or traditional female subordination and ideals of female equality, or individualism and social conformity, or democratic idealism and economic desire materialism. Any one of those kind of pairs, any pair from our very long list, your intro is going to say, here's the pair I've chosen, and here's what each of those terms mean in the context of the time period where the text I'm studying was written. And since the text we're looking at now are 19th century texts, that makes sense to be a logical place for our focus to be. So what do these what do these two terms I'm sharing with you in my introduction, what do these two terms in this cultural context, what did they mean to Americans of the 19th century? And that's what we're going to try to do. And so you can see here on the rubric, the introduction says you're going to define each term separately and then examine the ways they intersect. And we're not going to mention any specific texts yet. That's going to wait for the intro and the body paragraphs. Here we're just explaining to our readers, here's the tension I'm going to look at, and here's what it meant to 19th century Americans. Now, let's pause for a second and step aside and take a look at a sample intro. And this one is from your sample essay that I've given you. It was written a few years ago by an amazing student named Brian. And Brian was writing about William Faulkner. And so his context for discussing reason and religious faith, which was his tension, intellectual reason and religious faith, his context was 20th century America, because that's when Faulkner was writing. In fact, he says right at the top, mid-20th century America. So what I want to point out to you is how well Brian sort of follows the rubric criteria. You'll notice he starts with religious faith. You'll notice that he spends multiple sentences explaining what religious faith meant to 20th century Americans. So you can see there that we've got a nice big healthy half of a paragraph walking us through what that means. And then he looks at what he calls an opposing ideology of reason. And he walks us through how reason worked for 20th century Americans, what he calls the ideology of reason. And he's going to spend, again, 2 or 3 sentences walking us through what reason was and how it worked. And you'll notice he connects it to science and technology, which I think is an interesting argument. And then, after he's done a really nice job defining both of his terms, he now moves into the tension between the two terms. And he talks about how science and technology of the mid-20th century, embodied by, say, the atomic bomb, raised profound questions about God and whether there could be such a being could exist in this kind of world of monstrosity and technology. And he goes on and he really kind of walks us through that struggle between these two ideas. And he has a really nice sentence that sets up his thesis here that I think is a really good example of what I mean by really laying things out for us. He says these opposing views would continue to fight for power and walks us through how they're at odds with each other. And then he ends with the thesis. And notice he's not going to mention any specific texts until he gets to the thesis. Everything before then is simply a matter of defining his terms. What did intellectual reason mean to 20th century Americans? What did religious faith mean to 20th century Americans? How did these two ideas collide? All right, and that's really all we're doing for this first part of our paper, where we're drafting what we want to call part of the introduction. We're going to add the thesis later, but for now, we're defining our cultural tension and exploring how these two separate terms that we carefully define separately interact with each other. So again, it's the idea of separately defining each term and then examining how they intersect. Separate definition, exploration of intersection. You can see that language again over here on the other side of the rubric, where it talks about defining each term independently, exploring how the terms interact. No discussion of specific text before we get to the thesis. So that's what I want you working on now, drafting that almost all of your introduction, where you identify your cultural tension you're going to look at, you define each term, you explore how they interact with each other. Notice, by the way, how Brian jumps right into it. How he doesn't have some long sentence about since the dawn of civilization, people have blah, blah, blah. He gets right into what does my first term mean in the 20th century? What does my second term mean in the 20th century? How do they collide in the 20th century? Don't need any preamble. This intro is the preamble. It's defining terms you'll use for the rest of the paper. Don't worry, you are framing the argument enough for your reader. You don't need those broad, chew-up words, chew-up paper-space sentences about all of American history, all of humankind. Get right to your tension in your time period. And the best first sentence will be a sentence that looks at the first of the two elements in your tension. All right, I hope that's helpful. I'm looking forward to seeing what you come up with as you start drafting and writing. See you in Blackboard.